It is Thursday here on the Locked On Network, and you know what that means. It is Crossover Thursday. We are crossing over with Locked On Chiefs to preview Miami's big Week 9 matchup against Kansas City, being played in Germany.
You are Locked On Dolphins, your daily Miami Dolphins podcast, part of the Locked On Podcast Network, your team every day.
All right, Miami, welcome to another episode of Locked On Dolphins. It's your team every day here on the Locked On Network. I'm your host, Kyle Krabs, and it is Crossover Thursday, so we're going to be joined by Chris Clark, diving in everything Dolphins, Chiefs, Frankfurt, Germany, this Sunday, 9:30 p.m. Eastern Standard Time. Let's get into it.
And we are back for another crossover episode. We are talking with Kyle Krabs from Locked On Dolphins. So this is going to be a fantastic show. The Chiefs and the Dolphins are playing in Germany. There is a lot to talk about in this episode. We are brought to you today by PrizePicks. This crossover Thursday episode is brought to you by PrizePicks, the most easiest and most exciting way to play daily fantasy sports. Go to prizepicks.com/LockedOnNFL and use code all lowercase LockedOnNFL for a first deposit match up to $100. Kyle, this game is going to be awfully early in the morning, a little bit earlier for me than it is for you. But how much are you looking forward to this one in Germany?
I'm glad it's not an Arrowhead. I'll say that. I will more than happily profess that when the schedule came out and they said, yeah, you're going to play the Chiefs away, but it's international game. It was kind of the collective. Man, because we got some tough road games on this schedule this year. And to avoid Arrowhead, at least this time around, who knows? Maybe we see each other a little later down in the season, and who knows that this game very well likely could determine where a game like that hypothetically could be played, because there's big picture conference perspective here. But I'm excited to get it done early on Sunday. There's nothing worse than I'm just coming off a couple weeks ago doing Sunday night football and waiting all day. I'll take the 9:30 kick any day of the week over an 8:30 p.m. kick and having to stay up and then do a podcast afterwards. That's the toughest part about what we do.
It is, because you have to try to have the energy at midnight.
Right.
And that isn't always easy to do, especially if the game gets your energy spent in ways because you're cussing at the TV or well, I'm sure you probably never do that, but yeah.
No, never.
Yeah. All right, so let's get into this right now. What is the biggest story for the Miami Dolphins heading into this game?
I think the thing to watch for Miami is player availability. At some key spots along the offensive line and in the secondary. They've been very strategic this year, and the Dolphins last year kind of ran out of gas from a personnel perspective late in the season. They had injuries that really piled up. You get week 15, 16, 17, and guys were down because they were playing through injuries all season long. You've kind of seen a different ideology with them thus far this season, where Xavier Howard didn't play the last 2 weeks. He told everybody ahead of Sunday Night Football against the Eagles in week 7, yeah, I'm good to go. I'm going to play on Sunday. Well, he had a groin injury and he didn't play, and he didn't just play against the Eagles. He didn't play against Patriots last week either. And you've got some offensive linemen that are banged up. Connor Williams has had a groin injury himself that he first suffered against the Denver Broncos in week 3. He missed week 4, was back for week 5, and has not played since. He re-aggravated it. And they have been very deliberate talking about, we want to make sure that there's not long-term implications for our talent and our players. Well, now it's week 9. You get a bye week after this. It's a conference game. Connor Williams, Mike McDaniel came out on Wednesday during his press availability and said he expects him to play in this game. Teron Armstead has been on IR since after week 4. He's practicing. The window is open. He was limited in practice with the knee injury that he suffered against Buffalo in week 4. So does he play in this game? Xavier Howard, who we already mentioned, Javon Holland's coming out of concussion protocol. He missed the game against the Patriots in week 8. So you got Jalen Ramsey back last week after the meniscus repair that he had. So Miami, it feels like they're going to have an opportunity here to now make a decision and say, okay, it's one game, high stakes, AFC conference. We'll let some of these guys that we've been overly conservative with off the leash and go play, because we know we have the bye week coming off of this game to try to have all hands on deck to win the football game. I think that's the biggest thing for the Dolphins coming into this one.
Well, and you look at, Teron Armstead, that's a big question mark for me. And I understand, you said he's limited. When I look at that, I'm like, okay, well, if they don't have him fully practice at some point this week? Do they continue to think about letting him play and activate him to play in this game on Sunday? Knowing that they have a bye week, they can give him 2 more weeks to basically get healthy. And that's going to be a need for you long term at left tackle. But you also feel like you would need him in this game against the Chiefs because you're going up against a team that has a pretty decent pass rush. So I can understand there's a lot of different questions and a lot of moving pieces here. Seems like the Dolphins are getting a lot healthier while the Chiefs are actually losing players, it seems. Willie Gay missed practice. He's probably, I would assume, not going to play this week, but we'll see how that ends up. The biggest storyline for Kansas City right now, though, is losing to the Denver Broncos. It's a question of what team are you going to get. This is a Jekyll and Hyde team, and I really can't tell you what team is going to show up on Sunday. Look at what they did to the Chargers 2 weeks ago, and they beat them 31-17, and the game really didn't even feel that close. And now you're in a situation where you lose to the Denver Broncos. You cannot even score a touchdown against the team that you beat 16 times in a row. Now, obviously, it gets a little bit harder every single time you play a team, but it's one of those things where they just looked out of sync the entire game. Patrick Mahomes did have the flu, so that explains a little bit of it. But overall, the offense was just out of sync. They couldn't get anything going, and you can't turn the ball over 5 times and try to beat anybody in the NFL.
Yeah, and I know we talked a little bit in the pre-show, had a chance to watch the game, and just the 5 turnovers that you mentioned, so out of characteristic for Andy Reid too, with the precision. And looking at this team, the 5 turnovers aside, they've had a pretty reasonable amount of turnovers in the first chapter of the season anyway. And you think about the youth that they have at wide receiver. I'm sure at some point we'll talk about Tyreek Hill against his old team and that storyline. But I guess my biggest question for you is, aside of Travis Kelce, who's been that player that Pat's been able to kind of show some trust in? So if they need to get something started, and maybe it didn't happen against Denver, but thus far this season, who's been that other guy? Because I know Juju Smith-Schuster departed, and they've kind of had some personnel changes at wide receiver.
It's a great question, and I don't know that I have a great answer for you. I mean, they've been using Rashee Rice a lot more. He's been getting more snaps. He's been getting more targets. But when you start looking at, does he actually trust him? I mean, it looked like Rashee Rice got past his drop issue that he was having earlier in the season. And then, going up against Denver, he's got a wide open pathway in the middle of the field, and he drops an easy ball that was right in his chest. So, is that going to continue to have Mahomes give you more trust? I don't know if that's really going to end up being the case. So we'll see how that ends up. But at this point, it's one of those things where I don't know that he really has somebody outside of Travis Kelce. You can look at MVS, you can look at Sky Moore, you can look at Kadarius Toney. All 3 of those guys aren't really getting a ton of targets. And then you look at a guy like Justin Watson, who comes in and maybe gets 2 or 3 targets a game, but it's usually 25, 26 yards down the field, and it's looking for big plays. But it doesn't really seem like he has somebody that he trusts outside of Travis Kelce right now. Although if I was to pick one, it would probably be Rashee Rice.
And the other big talking point going into this game before we kind of get into some of the individual matchups, because I think there's a lot of fascinating opportunities for both teams on either side of the ball, is Miami coming into this game with the 6-2 record. You'll hear a bunch of the networks talking about Miami in big game situations. You really look at how they've performed since the Mike McDaniel era started in 2022. Probably their hallmark win right now was the Week 3 2022 comeback, or Week 2 victory over the Baltimore Ravens, where they scored 42 points, came back from a 21-point fourth quarter deficit. And then the following week at home, they beat the Bills 21-19. So it's been a while since you've beaten top of the conference type opponents. And at some point, Miami's got to do it. And, Mike McDaniel out of the Sunday Night Football game where they played in Philadelphia, talked about that environment being a really helpful learning tool for this young team that has not been there, done that, like Kansas City has, performing on the national stage, competing for championships annually for seemingly the last 5 years now. That's not really Miami's DNA just yet, but they have a really young nucleus. They've added a couple guys between Tyreek Hill and now Jalen Ramsey who have been there, done that. And it'll be interesting to see how those guys, especially getting them both on the field for the first time in one of these big game settings, kind of sets the stage for Miami to see how ready they are to play this team. I know the Chiefs, obviously coming off the loss to the Broncos, you feel like you're in a valley versus a peak if you're Kansas City, I'm sure. But for the Dolphins, it's a prime opportunity, and they went out on Monday, and they got out there for this international game. They're practicing there all week, and you could kind of feel that they're chomping at the bit for another crack at a good opponent.
Well, I know Kansas City's going to be chomping at the bit, trying to get the bitter taste out of losing to the Broncos out of their mouth. That's definitely something that they don't want to be hanging on to for very long at all. And this is going to be a fantastic game. You have two of the offenses that have scored the most points in the NFL. Obviously, Miami's offense has been better than the Chiefs for the most part this season. But you're going up again. You have two quarterbacks that are playing very well, and you have really the biggest injury that I see that you guys have that would be a difference maker in this game offensively is you don't have A-Chain. Are you going to have Mostert? That's going to be a question. It didn't look like he practiced from what I saw, or maybe he was limited. I thought he was out, though.
He did not practice on Wednesday, yeah.
Okay, yeah. So, I mean, two of your top running backs going to be out. A-Chain's obviously out, but taking a lot of that speed off the field. But you still have Tyreek Hill, you still have Jalen Waddle, so you got to feel pretty good about that. But we're going to talk about matchups here in just a moment. But I'm going to let Kyle tell you about one of our newest sponsors.
Yeah, there's absolutely zero reason for you, even if it's a 9:30 Eastern Standard Time kickoff, to root for your favorite team on an empty stomach. That's why you have to tap in with DoorDash, one of our partners here on the Locked On Network. And, there's no tailgating opportunities this week. Maybe your neighborhood does a tailgate for the game, but I know for those Miami locals, if you are chomping at the bit for a good start to your day, or perhaps you get done the Dolphins game and you want to have lunch ready to go, as this game gets into the second half, you can use DoorDash to order everything from pizza, wings, from your local restaurants. I love Pierre's Caribbean, so that'll probably be lunch the next opportunity I have to order with DoorDash, but also all of your grocery opportunities as well. So the next time that the Dolphins or the Chiefs are at home, you can get all your tailgate essentials via DoorDash as well. And you can get 50% off up to a $10 value when you spend $15 or more on your first order when you download the DoorDash app and enter code LOCK23. That's LOCK23 for 50% off up to $10 on your first order when you download the DoorDash app and spend $15 or more, subject to change, and terms do apply.
All right, so let's hop into the matchups. And what is the biggest matchup that you see going into this game?
I'm really interested to see how the Dolphins choose to defend Travis Kelce, where you have a bunch of different schools of thoughts and ideologies that you've seen teams try to use to give the extra attention his way that he deserves and warrants with how good of a football player he is. Do you do what the Chargers have tried to do with Derwin James at times and take Jalen Ramsey, who's now back, and try to match him in coverage at times because he is a longer player, he's a more physical player, he's not as physical as Derwin James, but he's obviously an alpha coverage option for you. Now, that's not really something Vic Fangio has done thus far this season. It would be a very vast departure from what they've tried to do as far as playing matchups. They are a lot of quarters. They are a lot of cover 6. They are a lot of cover 3. So they like to play predominantly zone. And in that case, you've got a left corner, a right corner, and a nickel. And that's kind of how their defensive structure has worked. So to come out and say, we're going to plaster 87 with Jalen Ramsey, that'd be something far off the reservation of what they've done. But it's really interesting to think about. Do you do that because you're probably going to have Xavier Howard back, and now you also have Jalen Ramsey in the fray, having those two guys on the field for the first time this season? Or do you just throw bodies at it and say, hey, the wide receivers, nobody's really emerged from their wide receiver core, so we're going to take our chances with Ramsey and Howard on the outside and then just put the extra attention to 87 with all the other bodies in the middle of the field?
Yeah, it's going to be fascinating to watch. I'm really curious to see what Miami does in that aspect. I will say, when Kelce faced Jalen Ramsey a couple of years when he was at the Rams, he had his way with him a couple of times. Obviously, it goes both ways. So you're going to have to see how that turns out this time around. Kelce's probably lost a step since they played against the Rams a couple of years ago. The other fascinating thing when you look at this matchup is you're talking about Vic Fangio, who went and helped the Philadelphia Eagles try to stop the Chiefs in the Super Bowl and then went to Miami. Right. So I'm curious as to see what he learned from that game as to how to try to stop this team. You look at the different matchups, and one of the things I will tell you, Kansas City's offense has struggled against zone, so that's not something that's going to play into their advantage here. I'm really looking forward to seeing what they continue to do with Chris Jones and Charles Omenihu against whoever's playing your left tackle. If your left tackle's back, that isn't going to be a good matchup there. If he's not back, that could be a problem for Miami, and that's really one of the things that I think has been fascinating about what Spagnuolo has done. And when you look at what their defensive line coach has been doing in Joe Cullen, using Chris Jones, using Charles Omenihu, using Mike Dana, and all those guys going up against the defensive line and really moving them around. George Karlaftis is another one, trying to get one-on-one matchups going against the offensive line. The coverage has been pretty good for Kansas City, so that's going to be something that will definitely have to be watched as well. But right now, I'm really curious as to see how this defensive line is going to go up against that offensive line. If they can get to Tua, I think that really helps the Chiefs' chances.
Yeah, for sure. And I have had a chance to see enough Kansas City to completely admire what Spagnuolo has done this season. I think that defense is playing well. Obviously, they're second in the league in scoring defense at 16 points per game. And I do think the fascinating element here when Kansas City is on the field defensively, as you mentioned, the injury to Willie Gay and kind of his status being up in the air, Nick Bolton with the wrist injury. Miami loves to eat the middle of the field. So the question is, are you going to try to man these guys up with Tyreek Hill and Jalen Waddle, or are you going to play zone? I know they're pretty diverse with what they do in coverage, but if the answer is zone, then the stress is going to be on Leo Chenal and signed from Los Angeles, Drew Tranquill. Yeah, Drew, those two guys will be the stress points for Miami. Now, they'll have to run the ball to successfully kind of occupy those guys and create those intermediate voids over the middle of the field that they love to hit so much, but obviously not ideal for Kansas City, but they can mitigate that if they feel like they have the opportunity to play physical on the outside and play man-to-man with them and not put so much stress on the zone coverage in the middle of the field.
Yeah, it's going to be curious. Tranquill, that's going to be a fascinating matchup, and they're going to definitely miss Nick Bolton. But, you talk about Leo Chenal. I'm not so sure it's going to be Chenal. It could be Jack Cochran. It could be Darius Harris. Chenal has been the guy that's been playing mostly as one of their outside linebackers when they are in their base. I don't think that they're going to use him as one of their, two down linebackers, or when you have two linebackers on the field. I think that's probably going to be somebody else just based on skill set. He's not really a coverage guy. So I would think you'd probably go with Cochran and maybe Darius Harris, who they just signed from the Raiders, but he was in Kansas City, so he knows the system. When you start looking at, the matchups and you start talking about how they're going to match up with Tyreek Hill and Jalen Waddle, I'm really curious to see what they do with L'Jarius Sneed. They've had Sneed travel with some wide receivers. Are they going to do that this week with Tyreek Hill? Or are they going to match him up with Jalen Waddle and have him travel with Jalen Waddle? That's going to be something that's going to be fascinating. Trent McDuffie's probably the best corner in Kansas City, even though L'Jarius Sneed is getting a lot of credit as well, and he's been playing pretty well. But he's been playing mainly nickel, and I would imagine that's probably going to continue to be the case this week.
Another matchup that I'm looking forward to is the Dolphins' defensive line of their own against Kansas City, where I know there's been some transition at offensive tackle with Orlando Brown and Andrew Wiley leaving this past offseason and having Jawan Taylor get signed to a big contract extension or a big contract to come over there from Jacksonville, and Donovan Smith serving as the other offensive tackle. And the Dolphins got Jalen Phillips back without a snap count last week against New England. He'd missed a little bit of time with a lower back injury or an oblique injury. Bradley Chubb has turned in probably the best 3 games he's played as a member of the Miami Dolphins since he was acquired at the trade deadline last year. The last 3 weeks, he's really turned it on. Andrew Van Ginkel was a rotational guy who stepped up big time early in the season when Phillips went down against the New England Patriots. He was all over the field. So they have some speed, they have some size, they have different guys that can attack you in different ways. And that interior trio for Kansas City is about as good of a group as it gets in the league, right? And that they can really move you. They got a lot of talent. But it's the tackle position for me where, especially when Kansas City was a little out of sync last week against Denver, and you saw some of their long athletic guys that kind of got Pat off his spot pretty early and had to try to create outside of structure. If Miami can create some of that same success, I think that goes a long way in them achieving what their hopes are as far as limiting Kansas City to a point total that Miami could potentially win this football game.
It's funny you mentioned getting Pat off his spot and getting him outside the framework of the play and outside the pocket. Usually in the past, that's actually where he's thrived. And this season, he doesn't seem to have that same ability to this point. He doesn't seem to be on the same page with the wide receivers, and I think that's part of it. You make a great point, though. The tackles are going to be a big question mark going into this game. And one of the biggest reasons they're going to be a big question mark is because Kansas City likes to leave them on an island. There is times when they will help the tackles at times if they get consistently beat throughout a game. But generally speaking, the tackles are on an island most of the game until they are getting consistently beat. Donovan Smith had one of his best games last week against the Denver Broncos, even though he did allow a sack. When you go back and you watch some of it, he was giving Mahomes time, but Mahomes is coming off a spot a little early at times as well. So that's going to be a fascinating matchup to see how Miami's defense goes against this team. The other thing that I'm really going to be intrigued about is what do the Chiefs wide receivers do? And I wish I could really throw out one name, but it's all of them. They don't really have a guy that specifically you call their number one receiver. I mean, Rashee Rice, like I said earlier, is a guy that is going to get most of the targets probably at the wide receiver position. But, you have Sky Moore, you have MVS, you have Kadarius Toney. You could have a guy, you could be bringing back a wide receiver from injured reserve this week, which I don't really know that you really need to do, but they got to figure out what they're going to do at wide receiver and how they're going to attack the Miami secondary, because they have to be able to give Pat time to throw and give Pat targets. And that's going to be a big key in this game because they've got to be able to put up points. The defense has been playing fantastic and has only allowed one team over 20 points this season in the Denver Broncos. And we both know that the Broncos offense isn't near what the Miami offense is. And it looks like you guys are finally starting to be healthy.
Yeah, the health component, don't ask me my confidence level for up front until probably 90 minutes before kickoff when the inactives come out. It'd be the first time you really get a gauge on who's going to go and who doesn't.
Fair enough, but that is definitely something we're going to be watching and trying to see how that plays out for the Dolphins. But I'm going to tell you about our friends over at PrizePicks. If you haven't checked out PrizePicks yet, you need to. PrizePicks is absolutely one of the funnest ways to play fantasy sports. You pick 2 to 6 players, and you decide who you want to pick in different games. It could be Travis Kelce. It could be Tyreek Hill. It could be Jalen Waddle. It could be Patrick Mahomes. Lots of different picks that you can go with. Do you want to go with Joe Burrow for more than 2 passing touchdowns and Travis Kelce for more than 75 receiving yards? I think that would be a pretty good pick. Generally speaking, the way that this season has played out so far, you could also look at Jamar Chase for more than 75 receiving yards and Josh Allen for more than 2 passing touchdowns. Another possible pick that would probably play out pretty well this week. PrizePicks is really simple to play. I can make my picks and submit my entry in less than 60 seconds. Quick withdrawals, easy gameplay, and an enormous selection of players and stat types are what makes PrizePicks the #1 daily fantasy sports app. Go to prizepicks.com/LockedOnNFL and use code LockedOnNFL for a first deposit match up to $100. That's prizepicks.com/LockedOnNFL and use code LockedOnNFL for a first deposit match up to $100. PrizePicks, daily fantasy sports made easy. All right, Kyle. Now let's get into the fun part of it. What do the Dolphins have to do to win this game?
I'll take the low-hanging fruit and say if they win the turnover battle. I think this is one of the most essential opportunities for them to do that. And the Dolphins really have not had a lot of success with the turnover battle this season. They lost it against the Patriots. They ironically won it against the Eagles and lost by 2 touchdowns after a late touchdown drive that made that 1-score game a 2-score game with about 5 minutes left. And they lost the turnover battle each of the previous 3 weeks before that, and they went 2-1 in that stretch. So they have had just as many games this season with 0 turnovers as they had with 1 turnover defensively. Now, and you'd like to think Jalen Ramsey comes back. He has the interception of Mac Jones. You're getting Xavier Howard back. Like, how are they going to distribute the targets? If you're going to crowd the middle of the field and play with guys on the islands, on the outside, more bodies around the football. But you have to steal possessions, especially against elite quarterbacks. And they really have not done that with a level of consistency this year. Now, they faced Jalen Hurts and had a 4th and 4 on the 40-yard line and an opportunity to get off the field. And Hurts gets outside the pocket and gets outside of structure and hits A.J. Brown down to the 1 yard line for a back-breaking play that leads to a touchdown to break the game into a 2-score game for Philly in the first half. So winning outside of structure, getting Pat Mahomes on the ground and winning the turnover battle are, I think, two things that you can't breathe second life into this Kansas City team, because Miami, they only have one game this season where they haven't turned the ball over at least once, and that was the Denver game. They operate with a lot of volume. They operate with a lot of complexity. They operate with a lot of nuance, but that at times leads to errors that turn the ball over. And you have to have the ball bounce your way in that component when both teams have the ball if you're going to win this game against Kansas City.
It's low-hanging fruit, but I can't disagree with you at all. I mean, I think that's exactly where Kansas City has to be as well. I mean, you look at the way that they played it in different games this year, and they just keep turning the ball over. And when you turn over the ball on a regular basis, you're not going to win games, and that has come back to haunt them multiple times. And, you're looking at a situation last week where it's a one-score game. Kansas City holds Denver to a fourth down, and they punt from inside their own, you pass their own 50, and inside Kansas City territory, they punt, and the punt returner fumbles the ball, and it goes right back to Denver, and they score a touchdown. That is backbreaking, not only for your team in general, but especially for your defense. Your defense went out there, they did their job, they slowed them down, and you let them get the ball on the 10-yard line, and generally speaking, you're going to allow a touchdown in that scenario, and that's exactly what happened. The biggest thing for Kansas City in this game, obviously, turnover battle, but it's also making sure the Dolphins are, having to drive long fields. Granted, speed kills, and Tyreek Hill and Jalen Waddle have plenty, and they've scored plenty of long touchdowns. But the consistency of the defense to get stops, if they have, 60, 70 yards for the offense to go, goes way up for this Chiefs defense, because they find ways to get stops at different times. They can find a way to get 3 or 4 plays in a row to slow a team down if they have the opportunity to force them to go long distances. The other part of it is, Kansas City's, their offense has to get going. They have to be able to score touchdowns in the red zone. They're horrible this year. It's like, I think 50% of the time they've scored a touchdown in the red zone, when they were leading the league last year, closer to 70%. They are just not getting it done. So if they are able to put the ball in the end zone when they get in the red zone, 60, 70% of the time this week, maybe even 80% of the time, and then they win the turnover battle, I think Kansas City can win.
Yeah, and I'm glad you mentioned that. Miami is 28th in the league in defensive red zone success rate. 65% of trips into the red zone have yielded touchdowns for opposing teams. But Miami 74% offensively, so they're the number one team in the red zone. So this very well, and Vic Fangio is a bend don't break, right? There's times where they'll give you yards. And we're going to say, if we can hold you to 2 possessions where you get down inside the red area and you have to kick, and then we can steal 2 possessions, as long as we don't have to kick when we get down there in the low red zone, that can be the turn of the game. So I think all of your critical cliches are cliches for a reason for this game, and they're all going to be applicable because this is 2 very talented teams that are playing each other, regardless of what they look like last week or the week before that.
Yeah, and one of the things that helps Kansas City when they get down in the red zone is, generally speaking, they can force teams to kick because their defense is talented, and when the field shrinks, it helps them. We'll see whether or not that actually plays into it this week. Obviously, it's going to be a little bit different because you're not in Denver and you don't have the thin air. I also think that wore out the defense being on the field as much as they were in the second half last week. So, but I feel pretty good that if they can do win the turnover battle and score in the red zone, and obviously hold Miami, which is going to be tough in the red zone, they're going to feel pretty good. But the other thing I would say is Andy Reid needs to figure out this week that he needs to be more aggressive. They got down to, I want to say, the 2-yard line last week and kicked a field goal instead of going for it on fourth down. Now, maybe you don't get the points there, but 7 there is a lot better than 3. And it's when it's early in the game, it feels like you're chasing points, but going up against the Dolphins, you're probably going to have to do that a little bit. So that's something to watch as well.
Yeah. Now, as far as a prediction for this game, I want to pick Miami to win the game, but I need to know who is dressing on the offensive line before I could say so with any level of confidence. So you have potentially Teron Armstead coming back. If he does not it would be Kendall Lamb at left tackle. He's been a rock solid swing tackle who stepped in his absence, but he's not Teron Armstead. You have Connor Williams, who's missed the last month, and Mike McDaniel said he expects him to play, but Mike McDaniel's also said he is optimistic for guys, and then they end up not playing on Sunday anyway. So is this sitting another game and then the bye, like you mentioned with Armstead, do they end up doing that with Connor Williams with a soft tissue injury as well?
And that's the other question, is if he is able to play, how healthy is he going to be? Is he going to be able to be close to, it doesn't have to be 100%, but can he be 80 or 90%?
Right.
If he can't be 80 or 90%, then why is he going to be out? I mean, I wouldn't think you'd want him out there.
And then right tackle Robert Hunt had a hamstring issue in the first half against New England and did not return to the game. So you had backups at left guard, center, and right guard, and your third string left tackle at one stage because Kendall Lamb went out for a possession with a lower body tweak. So it's like, Lord have mercy. Can we get the bodies up front? You're on O-line 9 is playing in the game. So that for me is going to be the critical component to, I think if Miami gets Connor Williams, Robert Hunt back, and even if it's Kendall Lamb, I feel like they have a puncher's chance to win this football game. But if they're coming into the game and they're down and you got to block Chris Jones with O-line 7, 8, and 9 on the depth chart as your interior guys, I just don't think that formula is going to work. And I think Chris Jones would have the potential to wreck this game plan enough single-handedly to prevent Miami from having the consistency they need offensively to score enough points.
And I have to ask a quick question along those lines. Do you think that there is a aspect of being able to punch Miami in the mouth and that kind of slows their offense down? Do you think that's been a problem in their losses that they've had?
I definitely think the Buffalo game was punch per punch for the first 20 minutes. The first 5 possessions of the game, they traded touchdowns.
Yep.
Then at that stage, Teron Armstead gets injured. The Dolphins shoot themselves in the foot with a couple penalties, and then they got completely away from the running game. And then they play against Philadelphia, and Hassan Reddick off the edge, too much speed, and gets backfield penetration on the first couple possessions and kills the drives. And even though it was never more than a 14-point deficit in the first half, and it was a 7-point deficit at halftime, they got completely away from the running game again. So that is another part of the offensive line health and availability is this team is still number one in running the football and on yards per carry and a raw rushing yards basis, but they have not had success the last 2 weeks, and it's because the offensive linemen are down. So what's your formula to get the running game back going? I think if Miami can find some early success running the ball, I don't think it would be downhill. I think in this game it would probably be trying to test the edge because I know they got some big body guys that can play on the edge. So can you get leverage there and have speed out of the backfield to get outside? If they can do that, then I think you take away the ability to force Miami to be one-dimensional. But if you shut them down early, that has been a component that has played against Miami is they kind of get away from the running game too early.
Makes a lot of sense. And, when I look at the prediction for this game, going into this game, if they would have won against Denver, I probably would feel a lot better about this game than I do right now. I would love to say that I think Kansas City wins. I'm just not sure at this point. Being down Willie Gay, it could be a huge loss for them in the middle of their defense. When their defense has been playing so well, and to lose him could be a huge loss with being down Nick Bolton already. You have a guy in Tranquil who got banged up last week, had to come back in after an injury. Obviously, he's still playing, but again, we go back to how healthy is he? Is he going to be able to play? And you talk about all the speed that Miami has. That's going to be a big issue if he can't go 100%. That'll be a big issue for this team. Right now, I still feel like Miami's probably playing better football. Whether or not it shows up on Sunday is going to be a big question. It's going to be, can Kansas City's offense be consistent? If they can be consistent like they played against the Chargers, that's one thing. If they play anything like what they did in their losses, that's a completely different issue, and you're going to have huge problems against Miami's defense.
Well, that's how I think you're primed for a really good game when both hosts here on Locked On come on the show and they want to give the nod to the other team as compared to say, I host Locked On Dolphins. The Dolphins are going to win the game, and I host Locked On Chiefs, and the Chiefs are going to win the game. The offensive matchup should be outstanding. I think Miami has a great opportunity to showcase full strength defensively, what they have. Obviously, Kansas City. I hope everybody that is able to play does play because you do want to test yourself against the best. And for a young team in Miami that's coming up, you want to showcase yourself against what Kansas City's got. You don't want to come out of that game and say, "Oh, well, they had guys down, and that helped us win the game."
Yeah, you never hope for injuries, and you always hope for health and to have the best games possible. So that's going to be it for us today. Kyle, I really enjoyed this. I'm guessing we're probably going to start playing you guys a little bit more often than we have been, because I'm guessing you're going to be dealing with first place teams in the AFC West and the AFC East. We'll see.
Please, you could sign me up for one of these every single year for the next 10 years, and I'd sign on the dotted line, and I'd take it right now. But it was great talking with you, Chris, and appreciate everybody who checked out Crossover Thursday. Make sure you check out all the shows that we have here on the Locked On Network. We have an outstanding family of podcasts for every sports. It's your team every day. We don't just say it, we live it. And I hope you guys enjoyed the game early on Sunday. Check out Locked On Chiefs for the aftermath if you're a Chiefs fan, and check out Locked On Dolphins for the aftermath if you're a Dolphins fan.